Welcome back to another episode of Even Tacos Fall Apart, where we talk all about mental health, advocacy, and personal growth. I'm MommaFoxFire, and today we have a very special guest joining us for an insightful and candid conversation. Our guest today is Brian. He's a mental health advocate, author, and coach who is deeply passionate about helping others navigate their mental health journeys and lead fulfilling lives. Brian brings a unique perspective to the table, having walked a path that combines personal experiences with a commitment to empowering others. In this episode, we will dive into his own experiences with anxiety and depression, his journey into mental health advocacy, the challenges he has faced along the way, and the misconceptions he aims to break. We'll explore the importance of finding the right mental health care providers and treating therapy as a tool that can be used as needed. As always, the whole purpose here on Even Tacos Fall Apart is to encourage open conversations and embrace diverse perspectives, knowing that every individual's mental health journey is unique to them. Whether you're a mental health advocate yourself or someone seeking resources to support your well-being, this episode is sure to offer valuable insights and inspiration. Without further ado, let's welcome Brian to the show and get this meaningful conversation started. Stay tuned for a powerful exchange of ideas, stories, and wisdom that will leave you feeling more empowered in your own mental health journey. Psst, it's Mama, the editor here. Just letting y'all know this one was recorded a while back before I got the new mic, before I got the new setup. So the audio in the episode itself might sound a little off, but just keep in mind that y'all's continued support is what allows me to upgrade equipment and continue making this kind of content. So right back to it, but you're going to hear some canniness. It was just maybe it had stopped for a moment. All right, thank you. Welcome everybody to another Mental Health Monday. Really excited for our conversation tonight. We're going to be talking about anxiety and depression, being a mental health advocate, and a lot of other things with our wonderful guest tonight, Brian Sachetta. So he is the author and owner of Get Out of Your Head, which is a brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. By trade, Brian's a software developer, which I'm really excited to talk about some of the parallels there tonight. He combines his experiences in the tech world with previous mental health battles to draw parallels between computer systems and the human mind and give readers practical strategies for evading their own psychological demons. Brian currently has 2 books out on the market, and I've got links to both of those for you here in just a second. The first one is Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. And the second one is Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. His mission is to help as many people, as many sufferers as possible through not only those books, but also his blog and podcast appearances. So if you're interested in any additional information, I've got website, Instagram, Facebook, 2 different book links. You're welcome to connect over here on the side. And thank you, Brian, for being here with us today. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to start off a little bit broad. What made you become interested in mental health advocacy?
Definitely. Yeah, it really was just my own personal history, background experiences, that sort of thing where, I zoom back to being in late high school, early college, and not really having the knowledge at my disposal of okay, what I deal with on a regular basis is blank, right? Is anxiety, is depression, something like that. And, there are obviously a lot of resources out there. You can find them if you talk to people, if you go on the internet, if you search in different places, but you obviously need to know what the right terms are. And you need to talk to sort of the right people, or at least the right initial person that then leads you down the chain towards the right person. When I was 18, I think, the kind of the beginning of the journey, as I would probably say, even though I think for a lot of us, we could probably, stem back further and find deeper roots or sort of the beginning of the journey, even before that, into childhood or something like that, right? But I always think back to being 18, going off to college, some of the trials and tribulations there, some of the anxiety that I dealt with. And I think, I say this on a lot of different shows and podcasts, which was basically, if you deal with anxiety, depression, some emotional disorder, something like that, for a long period of time, it eventually, I don't want to say it consumes you, but it becomes a large part of you. And it becomes a large emotional part of you to the point where you eventually say, this is such a significant part of my life. It's so like meaningful for me in a way, right? Obviously, it's like pain isn't necessarily the meaning there, but it's like this endeavor in general is something that I'm passionate about. I care a lot about. And so for me, it was going through 10 years of dealing with mental health issues, trying to find my way through them, and then turning around and saying, look, here are some of the strategies that I've developed for myself. I'm not saying that I'm like perfect here or anything like that, but I have a passion for sharing some of those stories and some of those strategies because I know what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody who experiences those things. And at times it can be really harrowing, right? So to go back and answer the question of what got me into it, it was really just the personal journey, the personal experience. And then somewhere along the way, I'm not exactly sure why, but I said to myself, I've made some progress. I have a passion for this thing. So let's see what we can do in terms of helping others.
Yeah. And I think you're right. A lot of people can go back very far, but it doesn't mean that you have to go super back to point to a moment to say, this is why I do what I do now. It could be something in your adult life that happened or that you experienced or that you saw somebody go through. Everybody's got their reasons, and it's really cool to kind of hear that you've been through something like that for so long, and it does become a little bit part of your identity sometimes. And I don't know about you, but it used to be a lot harder to find legitimate resources online. I think we're fortunate now that you can find so much information online. Official organizations have stepped up kind of their online presence, and even people like yourself and are sharing their stories. Wasn't a thing just a handful of years ago.
Yeah, it's a good point that you touch on. I even say in my first book, like, when I was 18 and I had like my first what I would call panic attack, I didn't know what the term even was, right? I was just like, I was so nervous, ridiculously nervous. I'm going into Google, like nervousness, whatever, right? I think you eventually sort of get there, but it is difficult, especially, you go back to 2008. And as you alluded to, there just wasn't as many resources, not as much information. One of the things that I talk about at the beginning of that first book, which I've already sort of mentioned here, is like, I'm on Google looking for resources, and I'm on like random people's websites. And obviously, like I am, for most people, I am a random person and I have a website. But this was like, a very old looking HTML website, right? And it's like you're paying $79.99 for some, I don't even know if people called them ebooks back then. It was sort of like a electronic PDF or something weird, some term like that, right? And you're reading it and it's like sometimes it was decent and sometimes it was just some person saying whatever. And I think, in a lot of ways, we are lucky that Google has gotten a lot bigger and better. And obviously, like, we're not going to go into the nuances of the pros and cons of tech behemoths and stuff like that. But just in general, being able to go to a web browser and search for terms and find things. And then, you can go to Amazon and you can say, okay, if I deal with anxiety, if I deal with depression, if I deal with OCD, I can go to charts for those things. And I can find, I can download the top 10 books or 10 best-selling books in those categories. So having those resources is great. And it's also wonderful that it's gotten easier to find some of those things over time.
Yeah, they've really gotten more accessible. So what is your favorite thing about what you do, about your mental health advocacy and sharing your story the way that you do?
Yeah, I think it's really just, as simple as helping other people. I talk about this a lot. It's like, I can go on podcasts all day and talk about my story and things that I've learned and whatever. But, when I get those messages on, sometimes it's Instagram, sometimes it's Facebook, sometimes people will email me. Those messages are like, one, it's really meaningful to see that some of the things that I've been through, I was able to turn those into a force for good, right? And to impact people's lives. I think also just being able to, regardless of even if it's me, to see somebody say like, I was doing X, I felt Y, whatever, and now things have changed. I'm in a much better position. That's really, really something. Like, that's one of those things that kind of makes me speechless or like, at a loss for words, right? That's really what it comes down to for me. And sure, it would be great to sell millions of books or anything like that. But, getting those messages, it's like you go back to the roots of the journey, right? And I say, I started this because, sure, there's times, when I was younger or whatever, where it's like, okay, maybe I'm writing this book a little bit for me. But I think as I get older too, it's just like, realizing that I'm staying in the battle, to help other people and getting those messages, see those things come through. That's what's really meaningful for me. I think on a smaller level, as a small independent publisher or author, it's a difficult road. You're up against these large companies that have a lot of marketing resources, have a lot of legal resources, and quite frankly can kind of squash you, right? And getting some of those messages from other people saying like, hey, this book helped me turn my life around or something like that, is a nice, it's sort of a reassurance in being able to say like, look, this is hard. It's hard for an independent author to go out there and try to make some noise. But those messages, it's not to toot my own horn. It's sort of a validation to say like, I'm on the right path and I'm doing things that are helpful and beneficial. So it's sort of a way of me saying like, yes, like I guess to repeat what I just said, I'm doing the right things,
Yeah. Yeah, if those messages really are super meaningful. Like I do this for very specific reasons, and just knowing that I helped one person, like I had somebody on Twitter just recently say, "You've really helped me through a lot." I didn't even know I had done that. So it was one of those things that I reached out to her and talked to her one-on-one, and it's like getting those messages that say, either you actually helped me through a lot of really dark days, or this community helps me a lot if it's something in Discord. Those messages really do mean a lot. And I hope that people are expressing to all creators out there, whether it's writers of books or content creators or whatever. If you appreciate something about somebody, tell them. It doesn't cost you anything just to send a note. That costs $0.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now that we don't have the AOL CDs.
Right. And you think about kind of turning that around, right? When you said, your book, your music, your game, whatever it was, like help me through some dark times, turn that around and think of like, I have had that same feeling about other people's works. And I know what that has felt like. I've been like, wow, like this song helped me so much this week. So again, kind of being able to put myself in other people's shoes, understand those feelings, and then also just be kind of, humbled at the sense of I actually helped this person. It's crazy. Like it's hard to put that into words.
Yeah. I think if everybody this week can just make a goal to like tell one other person, comment on a YouTube video, send a note to your favorite artist, whatever it is, review something on Amazon. If you've read this book, review it on Amazon, and just leave a kind word, because that's something that really does make an impact, and it could just make the next week a better place if everybody would do that.
Definitely.
Do you have a favorite book or a book that you feel like everyone should read?
Well, I guess those are sort of two separate questions, right?
Yeah.
I'll answer the first one in saying like favorite book. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. If I go back and I'm like, okay, what book has stuck with me the longest or whatever? Probably not what most people would expect me to say, because it's just not in the same realm as what we're talking about. But I'm actually, so it's funny because of what I just said, but also because I have 3 of these books stacked up and my computer's on top of them, so that way my face is closer, like more level with the computer. But so it's the Harry Potter series, which obviously like a lot of folks that are listening will probably have an emotional connection with, right? Especially our generation and growing up with them and when they were released and stuff like that. But for me, it's really like sort of the escapism in a positive sense, where I have read those books so many times and I know how great they are. And sometimes I do it just because I want to have fun, right? I want to read. I want to go back into the world. I want to re-experience the characters and the happenings and stuff like that. But sometimes it's like, hey, I'm not feeling so good today. Why don't I go read a little bit, go into Harry Potter, whatever book I'm on, or even if I want to jump around or something like that. And you start to realize that, like, yeah, again, songs can have a large influence on your experience and your emotions. The same with books, the same with movies and stuff like that. So there's so much there where it's like that the series holds a special place in my heart, where it's like, the nostalgia of childhood, just how good the books are overall, but then also that powerful coping mechanism of like, if I'm not having a good day, and I know that there's some sense of security there or certainty where I'm like, I know I can hop into the book and forget about my problems for a little bit. And that's really powerful.
Absolutely. Harry Potter is one of those series that I know that problematic issues with J.K. Rowling. I know. However, but, and that, negates everything that I just said. But it really does bring a lot of nostalgia for so many people. It's the book that my baby sister and my middle sister would read together every night. Like, they would wait for the next one to come out.
Wow.
And they would read it every night. A, to get my middle sister to enjoy reading, which now she's a voracious reader. B, to help teach my baby sister to read. And I was a little on the older side. So that series for me is Terry Goodkind's Sort of Truth series, and that's the one that I can just read over and over and over. And if I need a little bit of escapism, I can just hop into that. But Harry Potter really, so much nostalgia for so many people. It's a great, great series. I agree. So you talk about anxiety and depression in the books that you've written, and you talk a little bit about you having faced anxiety in high school. Did you also face depression? Is that something that you still face?
Yeah. So depression, I'm trying to decide how deep we want to dive into this one, right? I think there's there's sort of the people will throw the term around depression, say, oh, I'm depressed or something like that, right? Like your favorite team lost last night, I'm depressed or whatever. I'm not trying to downplay, anything that somebody is going through, but the depression that we're talking about, right, is something that lasts a good amount of time. It could be, if we look at the DSM, it's like feeling really negative for more than a period of more than 2 weeks. That's sort of what we're talking about. At the same time, I'm definitely not discounting, if you feel really bad for 7, that doesn't diminish your experience, right? It's still really awful to go through something like that. The reason why I sort of do this preamble is basically, I'm sure there were times in my life where I could point back and I could be like, I really didn't feel good for 7 days here. I really didn't feel good for 14 days there, whatever it was. If I look back and I think about the larger stuff, there were 2 large periods. So one when I was a senior in college, and then one which was about 4 years ago. Both of those lasted a decent amount of time. I would say it's sometimes it's hard to figure out, when it starts, when it ends, whatever. They were both sort of on the realm of 3 to 12 months or whatever. And the second one was actually what sparked me writing my second book. So I published my first book. It's funny because it was when I actually wrote the manuscript, I was 27. So this is the first book. And a lot changes in 5 years, right? I'm 32 now. And when I was writing it, I guess I was more of a kid, and you have these, I don't even know how to describe it. It was a little bit of an idiot, a little bit inexperienced, right? And you're I wrote such a great book. It's going to be amazing, yada, yada, yada. I have all this stuff figured out. And then at the end of it, as I'm getting ready to publish the book, I, underwent or fell into this second depressive episode that I had alluded to a second ago. And it was such a weird experience for me. Don't get me wrong. It was very hard to go through, and depression is very hard to go through. But the strangest thing to me was that what I had just said of I have all this mental health stuff figured out, and that's why I wrote the book, and I'm good now, whatever. It was a really weird wake up call, rude awakening sort of thing, where it was listen, dude, you might not have as much of a grip on this thing as you think you do. So just tread cautiously here, and it definitely brought me down a peg or humbled me a little bit. I think in the long run, it was positive in the sense that it sort of put me on the same sort of path where it was okay, when I was 18 and I dealt a lot with anxiety, and I spent years trying out different strategies, reading different publications and books and journal articles and whatever, synthesizing that information down into a book. I had already been on that sort of journey. So I knew that with the second book, it was once I realized the problem that I was facing, I was if I can get through this, if I can make sense of this, then I'm going to try to take that same approach that I did for book 1 and apply it to book 2, or this new endeavor, and try to create book 2. So that was really what inspired and made book 2 come to life. There's a lot of different things. We could jump into it if we wanted to or not. For me, I guess high level with that second episode and also the book, it was just a kind of a confluence of different factors. And I think why this might be helpful is to sort of talk about the contents of the book a little bit. So we think about depression. I think a lot of people think about depression as almost. In a lot of diseases, right? We try to distill them down and be it happened because of this one thing or that one thing or whatever. from my experience, and it's different for everybody. But that depressive episode was a confluence of many different factors. A few of them, it was like sort of this like quarter life crisis where it was like, wow, I feel it in my bones that I am getting older and life is moving by very quickly. You stew on that too long, and that's a spooky thing to think about. There were a few other things in there. It was like I had sort of put this dream job on a pedestal for a long time, and I finally got it. And it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And sort of this discrepancy between expectations and reality really like kind of hit me hard. And then also, during that same time, and there was a few other things I don't know, that comprised this experience. But one of the other ones I want to touch upon was like my grandmother passed away, and she was 90. She lived a really good life. She was an amazing person. It was like it was such an honor, and I was so lucky to have her in my life. It wasn't necessarily like this wasn't supposed to happen. This is like the biggest tragedy of all time. It was more, the wind swirling together of all these different things, and then being like, this really special person in my life who I loved so much, like she's gone. I don't have her support anymore. I can't call her, and that's it's funny because I go a million different directions at once on these conversations, but you look online in the medical community, and some people say there's like a grief exception, which is basically that like grief is not depression. And I'm like, dude, who cares? Like that, like who cares about the semantics? If you lose somebody that you loved and you feel awful and you question everything about your life and existence, like that is depression. And it's the feeling that we care about, right? So all of those things kind of came together at once, in a short period of time to make me feel awful. And do I look back and I say like I have all the answers? I don't, but I think like for all of us, right, we're trying to figure it out one step at a time. Luckily, I had been through some of that stuff previously where it was like, okay, I have some strategies, I have some perspectives, I can kind of, I've done this sort of thing before, maybe a different lane of it, but I've been on this journey before, so I just kind of need to apply some of those same tactics to this one and eventually get through it. And it's like I'd like to think that I have. The interesting thing, though, I guess kind of what I'll close out with here is, I think there's a tendency for us to say like, this episode started here and ended here, or it's clean cut or whatever. I think probably a more helpful perspective is to say that, being a human comes with a wide range of emotions. And some days we're going to feel good. Some days we're not going to feel as good. Just because we have a bad day doesn't mean that we've necessarily slipped back into, the pit of despair for a long time or something like that. So it's important to have that perspective. But then I guess I know I said last piece, but this will be the last piece, was sort of thinking about like the book 2 itself. Instead of, kind of looking like with book 1, it was more tactical, like, hey, you're anxious, here's what you do, use this step, use that step, whatever. And I know we'll probably talk about this in a upcoming question. But book 2 was a little bit more of like looking at things holistically, right? I talk about this this approach to diseases called the biopsychosocial model, which was put forth by a couple, I want to say psychologists at University of Rochester in the 70s, and it was basically saying that, like, if you look at something like depression, we can't necessarily just point at one thing and say like that caused your depression or something like that, or depression is just a disease of the brain or something, right? It's like there are all sorts of things that can make us feel helpless, make us feel hopeless, and it's important to bring that holistic perspective, because it's like if we go to a doctor who only specializes, who only looks at neurochemistry, they may be missing something. If you go to a practitioner who says, let's just look at your relationships, and you actually have a chemical imbalance, they may be missing something, right? So it's important to step back and look at all of those pieces. And I think, sort of why I wanted to bring that in was like, looking at my own experience and saying, okay, I talked about a few different factors. I wouldn't say that any one of those things necessarily caused the depression or anything like that. It's important to look at all of them and say, okay, biopsychosocial is sort of an amalgamation of 3 different words, right? It's the biological, the psychological, and the social. And it's important for us to say, how do I rebuild all of those parts of my life such that, I have steadier or sturdier ground to stand on?
I love what you're talking about, being in your 20s, going back to that, and then in your 30s and writing both books and thinking in the first one, like, you have the answers and now you don't have the answers. Like, that's very much my experience of people in their 20s and now people in their 30s, is that Dunning-Kruger effect of life, essentially. Like you get to a point where, and my oldest is 21, and so he's at the point where he's like up here. He knows everything. You can't tell him he's wrong. None of it. He knows all of it. And he's about to hit that, oh crap, I know nothing part of that curve. And then he'll go back up somewhere in his 30s to be like, okay, I know some things. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's not cookie cutter. None of it's cookie cutter. The reasons for depression aren't cookie cutter. The reasons for anxiety aren't cookie cutter. And if you're not looking at it from a holistic perspective, then you're likely to miss something. That's why whenever we talk about mental health advocacy, you have to work with your healthcare providers. You have to work with your mental health care providers. You have to work with, if you are a spiritual person, any of your spiritual guides or anything like that. You got to get the whole picture in there and really work with all of it. But yeah, I've had postpartum depression, which was very much a chemical imbalance. And I've also had major depressive disorder, which was not a chemical imbalance. I did get all of my labs done and stuff, and it wasn't chemical. It was situational. And so it's one of those things that you have to, but if I hadn't gotten all my labs and stuff done, I wouldn't know that. Maybe it could have just been treated with some medication. But in my case, at least for the major depressive disorder, it really wasn't treatable that way. So, it's always a unique experience, and you always learn something new every time. That's what I keep telling myself. So you talk about on your site that whenever you started looking for that external support, what you were finding was kind of all sunshine and rainbows, and that's kind of where your brand comes from, this really rugged brand of get out of your head. So whenever you found all this sunshine and rainbows on the internet, which is very similar to my experience, back in the day, they say, where did you turn to, and what worked for you at the time?
Yeah, I think it was really sort of just like, I didn't have a great strategy or like a great course of action. It was sort of just like, get out there and figure out what you can do. I alluded to, early in the conversation, getting on Google and finding different resources there, right? It was really like, if I say multiple pronged approach, it was sort of like I was working with a psychiatrist. I was reading different books on, mental health. I was taking psychology courses at college. I probably wasn't audiobooks. I think audiobooks were still a little early then, but it was like listening to different resources that I found on the internet, or maybe
tape books is what it was.
Exactly. Yeah. Book on tape or something like that. Yep. And then I think the other thing too was sort of, and this was where I sort of felt validated with, eventually writing the first book, was taking all of those different inputs. So whether it was reading a book or reading a journal article or working with a doctor or something like that, and then going to situations that made me anxious and saying, okay, I'm going to use an exploratory approach here where it's like, I read the other day that strategy X is supposed to make you feel less anxious, in preparation for something that makes you nervous. Let's try that strategy out. Okay, I tried that strategy, didn't work. On to the next one. It's like you can put all sorts of different like labels or like dress things up in a creative way. Like, and what I like to say is, because I come from the computer science realm, it's like I say that I A/B tested different strategies, right? It was like, okay, so the process that I just walked through, it was like, all right, I got a date in a week, and like I am anxious about it because I'm interested in this person. I'm going to try deep breathing, during the lead up time, and even like right before I get there, maybe even when I'm there. On the next date, let's try not deep breathing, let's do something else, or let's do nothing and see if I experience a difference between the control and the variant, right? So trying to, for me, see what worked and see what didn't, and then that sort of formed the basis of my first book, which was basically like, I call it this toolkit, is I throw a lot of different strategies at the reader, knowing that not every single one resonates with every single person, doesn't work for everybody, right? So it's like, here's a bunch of them. What I want you to do is I guess it's a little bit of tough love or something like that, where it's like, I can't cherry pick these strategies and be like, here you go, they all work, because I just know that they don't. And I think, the more that you delve into this, I think most people find that not every strategy does work for everyone. So it was sort of like, hey, reader, like you do have to do a little bit of work here, but I've gotten you started on the process. And also, like, I'm not just throwing bad strategies at them, right? It's like the ones that I have tried, sometimes work in one situation versus another, sometimes work for certain kinds of personalities or whatever. But that was the basis for the book, was like, hey, I've tested these things out. These are battle tested strategies. And just, as you synthesize them, as you read them, see, kind of put them in your own toolkit, try them out and see what works.
Absolutely. There was a tweet not long ago, and I don't remember who tweeted it, and I'm not going to name them even if I did, but they tweeted saying, like, all therapists need to stop teaching box breathing because it's bad. And I'm like, what the fuck? Box breathing works great for me. Like, I'm so glad my therapist taught me box breathing, because I use it with my 9-year-old whenever he's having a hard time, or I use it with my 15-year-old whenever he's having a hard time. Like, that's one of the strategies that really, really works for me. And you could see in the comments, just all of the comments, like, hey, actually, this has worked for a lot of my clients. Hey, this really worked for me. Actually, this saved my life. Like, there's a lot of things. So it's very much, if it doesn't work for you, that doesn't mean it's not going to work for somebody else. It just didn't work for you that time. This extreme. I think I've seen a lot lately of these extremes of this never works or this always works. And it's like, for you.
Yeah. And I actually had a similar conversation to this with my parents recently. And I said, in the self-help world, or in like the informational world, people want the absolutism, right? They want, hey, this always works, this never works, whatever. And I think it sort of draws people in. It helps sell more books or whatever. But sort of the what's the effect that you mentioned?
Effect? Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Where it's like, you think you know everything when you're 20, and then when you're 35, you're like, I don't know anymore. It's sort of that same sort of thing where, you get older and you say the absolutes, they don't, I don't want to like make it a double absolute what I'm saying here, but it's like absolutes, right? Absolutes never work.
Yes, right.
Which would be something that, I don't know, maybe you'd find in like a Yogi Berra book or something like that. But I think as you get older, right, you realize that there is a lot of gray area, and there is like, hey, this strategy is good. It may even be very good, but it's not going to work for everybody. And it's important to deliver the message in that fashion. But it's also weird where it's like, I think that it's important to deliver the message in that fashion for, so that way we don't turn people off. And that way people understand, like, hey, here's what I'm working with. But it's also weird where it's like people do kind of want that yes, this is absolutely going to work. No, this is not going to work. And that's, I think, sometimes why you get that sort of, like, you go on Amazon and you see a lot of 5 stars and a lot of 1 stars, and it's like, this was amazing, it worked for me. This was horrible, it didn't work. And it's like, the risk you run of being somewhere in the middle is that people, interpret you as wishy-washy, right? And you want to strike that balance, but it's hard.
Yeah. So going back to kind of the sunshine and rainbows part, do you think that culture of toxic positivity has subsided somewhat, or do you think that it's still very much there?
Yeah, I think it has. I think that, we were talking pre-show about COVID. I think that during COVID, it was sort of this forcing function where everybody was stuck inside. A lot of people were isolated. People that lived by themselves were seriously by themselves for a long time. And, when I say forcing function, it was sort of like so many people were so miserable that it was like, we have to talk about this stuff. We have to, start podcasts. We have to start brands. We have to put all this information out there in one way or another. And I think that's something like COVID, in the sense that, like, it was a negative event for our mental health, collective mental health, right? I think it forced us to get a little bit more real with it. Whereas in 2008 and 2000, whatever year, right? However many years ago, it was more sort of, there just wasn't enough in the space there. It was almost like, to sort of create a thread here, right? It was almost like the collective mental health space was that 20-year-old being like, we know everything, sunshine and rainbows, whatever. And then it's sort of like COVID happened. And I think just in general, the space grew and matured, and it was like, maybe we don't know everything. Hey, maybe it's important to just share our experiences, even if they are negative, if they were difficult to go through something like that. We need to do that because it's important. It's important to, get our emotions out there, to not let them grow and fester inside of us. So to answer the question, I do think that the space has matured a bit. I do think there's less toxic positivity out there. Could we always do better? I definitely think we could. And I also think that, like, there are definitely still places where we downplay or we overlook things, right? It's like, in this world of social media and trying to capture people's attention and have shock value and whatnot, it's like sometimes like we address mental health in ways that like don't make sense for a lot of people. It's like if somebody's like dancing on TikTok and like talking about anxiety, it's like that's probably not the right space, and it's like you can dress it up all you want, but like at the end of the day, this is still suffering that people go through, and I think we need to make space for that. So it's like we definitely are making space, but there's always room for more.
Yeah, I do think that's one of the positives that came out of COVID was that, and this is okay, positive, but hear me out. Everyone went through shit. Like everyone was collectively in this trauma space and had feelings about it, whether they were actually clinically depressed, whether their anxiety showed itself or got worse, whether they experienced some touch starvation, which isn't technically anything, but it is a real thing. That was a positive thing because now everyone, not everyone, but lots of people get it better than they did before. And it's like now when you talk about mental health and mental illness and what you're going through, people have something to compare it to and say, I've experienced that before. I understand what you're saying. I can connect with you better because of it. So yeah, it sucked. I like we were saying before the show, I never want to go through it again. It sucked, but I do think that there were some positives that came out of it. And that is one of them, is that we can relate to each other a little bit better now because of it.
Definitely.
As a software developer, this is something that I was reading on your blogs and everything. You draw comparisons to computer systems. How can computers help us understand the human mind?
Yeah, so I like to preface this sort of answer with the notion that like it's not a one-to-one comparison, right? It's basically the reason that I talk about this stuff is that I am a software developer full-time, by trade. So it's like I spend 40 hours a week, sometimes more, writing code, architecting different things. And it's like when mental health is your passion, or you have this side project where you're writing a lot and thinking about mental health, inevitably the two things are going to overlap at some point. Absolutely. You're going to be like, here are some parallels, whatever. So I don't want to mislead people to think that like, it's one-to-one. But at the same time, there are definitely some similarities that are important. I think one thing that I talk about a lot is like, it's, especially as a software developer, where it's like the basis of the job is to be a critical thinker, to be analytical, to be overly rational, right? To think things through, to think through all the edge cases and the corner cases and stuff like that. Yes, rationality is great, and critical thinking skills are amazing, and they sometimes lead us to have great, well-paying jobs or something like that. But if we take a critical and rational approach to mental health, that same approach, if we say, hey, all day I sit down and I figure out problems on the computer, let me turn around and take that same approach and apply it to my mental health, then we can run into some problems. And the reason, I think the main reason there is that like anxiety, depression, these things that we're dealing with are I'm not trying to minimize them or whatever, but it's like if we strip them down, they are emotions, right? And it is very hard to think through an emotion. I would say that you probably can't. At least there are times when you're like, okay, like maybe I'm gonna convince myself that I shouldn't feel so bad about the fact that I lost $10 yesterday or something like that. But for the most part, especially when it comes to anxiety and depression, you can't think through them, which leads me
logical. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's like. So it kind of leads me to a quote that I like by Albert Einstein, or it's attributed to him. Who knows if he actually said it? But the quote goes something like, you can't solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think as it applies to anxiety or depression, where I think that is really, really applicable is like we sit down and we say, I'm scared of going skydiving next week. I'm going to sit on the couch. I'm going to think about how everything's going to go okay. I'm going to see myself on the plane. I'm going to see the parachute opening. Like I'm going to think myself through the fear. I'm going to get there and I'm not going to be worried about it at all. And by virtue of doing that, I think we've all had that experience or something like it, where it's like 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, whatever it is, of these, sort of sitting down and having these rumination sessions, we then realize that the opposite of what we wanted to happen actually happened. And that is basically, we feel way, way worse about the situation than we did when we started that exercise. And some of that just comes down to like, we are going into the fear, right? We are rehashing it. We are sort of making it or propagating it through all of these thoughts associated with the things that we don't want to happen. And so it's like, again, just basically saying that you can't think your way through anxiety. You can't think your way through depression. I mean, I'm sure, like, don't get me wrong, like I have sat down and thought about different strategies that I then write in my books that people can then apply. But most of I don't even know how to describe it exactly, but the actual tactical boots on the ground sort of thing is not the critical thinking part. The critical thinking part is like, okay, I'm formulating my ideas and then I'm writing a book, right? So I think it's really important to make that sort of distinction, and that sort of leads me into another parallel with computer science, which is basically like, and this is a specific concept, but you have this notion of recursive functions, which is basically like a block of code, of computer code, can call itself. So it's like, I guess I'm not going to give an example because I don't want to spend too much time here, but basically like if you had a function that said like do something, right? And then inside of the function it said do something again. Like you'd basically just get stuck in this loop of doing something continually. In these recursive functions, you eventually need a base case that says like, if this equals that, or if this condition occurs, break out of this loop. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the computer is going to run out of memory or resources because it's just executing this code infinitely, right? And if you've ever heard of like an infinite loop or something like that, that's where the term comes from. Just like computers can do that, we can as well. So we can sit down and we can say, okay, I'm thinking through this thing, I'm thinking through this problem, like again and again and again and again and again. Eventually, like, and this is where the ethos of the brand get out of your head comes in, is like eventually we need to break free from that thinking. And we need base cases just as a computer function does, which is basically to say like, okay, if I'm sitting on the couch and I've been doing this rehashing thing for 15 minutes, I have to be able to put my foot down and say, I've been through this process before. I know that it's not, beneficial for me as much as I want to convince myself that it is, or as much as I think I'm, near an epiphany or something. I've been through it. So let's go over to the toolbox and let's say, bring out the deep breathing, go for a walk, something like that. That becomes that strategy, whatever one we pick, then becomes that base case that says, okay, break us out of this loop. And again, that's a specific one, but I think like it's just so interesting because like so much of the programming that you do on a daily basis, like recursion is a very common thing, and anxiety can be recursive. And so to be able to make the conclusion to say like, I need something to be able to tell me I got to get out of this, is a really important skill to have. And it's almost like, I don't want to oversimplify things, but it's like, if every single time that we were anxious or we were depressed and we were, rehashing the same sorts of thoughts, if we broke out of those loops every single time, I think we would do a lot better. It might be one of the most important things that we can do for our mental health and for those various conditions.
How do you personally break out of one of those loops?
Yeah, I mean, various strategies. I would say, going for a walk is one that I like a lot. Just kind of like getting my body moving, maybe listening to a song or a podcast or something like that. Deep breathing. I mean, it's funny because a lot of the things that I refer to as we're having this conversation are some of those things. So they're going to be repeated. But I run a decent amount 2 or 3 times a week. I go to the gym, and it's funny because it's like, yeah, we can't go for a 3-mile run anytime we feel anxious. Like there's only so many times that we can do that per week, right? But I think as you start to build those different outlets, you say like, okay, like I know that every morning I'm going to the gym and I'm going to start my day off right, because not only am I like, regardless of the physical component, it's like I know that going to the gym, going for a run gets me in the right mindset, gets me out of my head. That's going to then basically start my day on the right foot, right? And then from there, it's like peppering in the other strategies to keep things going. Again, it's like if we already worked out, we're probably not going to do it again. But if we start on a good foot and then we say, okay, I'm feeling a little bit anxious, it's lunchtime. Let me bring in some of these other strategies that are in my toolkit. So that's sort of like my general philosophy, but obviously different situations call for different things. It's like sometimes it's great just to like get together with somebody and have a conversation. And, it's all sort of in the ethos or in the name of getting out of your head, right? Whatever you can do, whatever resonates with you to be able to say, I'm done thinking about these things, or not even making that conscious distinction, just saying like, I'm going to go do this other thing. And hopefully by virtue of doing that, I won't even remember that I was in my head, 10 minutes from now.
I was going to be my next question is do you make it a conscious decision to say like, all right, I've been sitting here, I've been thinking about this, I've done all my daily ritual stuff that I do, I've gone and worked out, I've eaten the right things, I've drank enough water, all that normal stuff that you do, your routines. Is it a conscious decision for you if you're ruminating to go do something different, or is it now just kind of automatic?
It's a tough question to answer. Like, and I definitely don't want to like make it sound like I'm perfect or anything like that, right? I'm still human. I still struggle with these things from time to time. I think the difference is that I have the strategies, and it's like, as long as I use them, I usually fare pretty well. I think that the reason why the question is challenging to answer is the fact that so much of this rumination and overthinking happens on a subconscious level. Yeah. So it's like, by the time that we finally make the distinction or realization that we're way deep inside of our minds, then we're like, hey, okay, I now know I need to go do something. But that could have been a 30-minute process, a 10-minute process, something like that. There are obviously other times where like you, myself, other people may say like, may kind of catch the train rolling down the tracks before it leaves the station, but it's like once the momentum gets rolling, it can be harder to stop that progress. So I would say I don't have an amazing answer here. It's kind of more like, I think I've done a good job at developing the awareness to be able to say to myself more often than I used to, hey, this is a problem, I got to go do something else, but I'm still human and I still struggle with it from time to time for sure.
I mean, I don't think that if you had the one answer that you were like, this always works, it'd be a different conversation.
Yeah.
So that's
I would have sold a lot of books by now.
Yeah, right. No kidding. So that's kind of your toolkit for anxiety. Do you have a different toolkit for depression, or is it pretty much the same recommendations, resources as what you use for anxiety?
Yeah. So I guess it is different. I kind of want to touch on the toolkit for anxiety real quick, which is like, some of the things we talked about, deep breathing, going for a walk, things like that. Those are all strategies that I love, but also there are other strategies in the book. Like I have this framework called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And there are 10 other strategies. I mean, the first one is to do some deep breathing, but the other 9 are things that we haven't yet talked about. So it's sort of I'd be happy to touch on some of those things, but Absolutely. I don't know if we have enough time for all nine of the others.
Time. Do you have time?
Okay. Well, let's jump into one, and then we can actually answer the question that you asked. So, in this 10-step framework, it's basically just, all right, these are 10 tactics that you can utilize when you're in your head, when you're already feeling anxious, to kind of walk back some of the fear that you're feeling. So, step number 2 in the process is to, I believe this is step number 2, it's to determine the true importance of what's making you anxious. And I know that's kind of a mouthful, but basically, like, the thought process there is like, when we get wrapped up in our heads and we are super anxious, we have a tendency, it doesn't always happen, but to detach from the actual thing that we are worried about, right? And it's not, one way to put it is to say that we blow things out of proportion, but that's not really a nice way of saying it. And also, that's not always the case. I think one thing that was interesting was when I talked with a lot of folks during COVID, this one kind of came up again and again and again. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that COVID wasn't a big deal. It definitely was. But I talked to some folks who, were having issues with the virus. And just like, when I say issues, I mean, they were very anxious about it. And when we would have this conversation, the sort of cliff notes of the conversation was basically like, the person that I was talking with was like, if I step outside and I open my mouth, I'm going to die, right? I'm just going to like, basically collapse and die. And I'm like, look, don't get me wrong, like this is a disease that can kill people, and we need to be careful. But what is happening, or I think was kind of happening at the time, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't use caution or anything like that, obviously we should. But I think what was happening at the time was like, we were all trapped in our houses. One of the only things at our disposal was the TV. And it was like, we're getting on the TV, we're hearing all these daunting broadcasts, like, oh my goodness, this, that, whatever. And our anxiety over the disease, the virus itself, sort of propagated and became this thing where it's like we turned, and again, it was still a serious thing that we needed to give attention to and be cautious with. But I think a lot of us sort of turned it into this monster of like, again, I'm going to step outside my door and I'm going to die. And the same sort of phenomenon can happen with anything that makes us anxious, right? We get in our heads and we sort of detach from like, if this, I don't know, I'm kind of using my hands here for folks that are just listening on the audio, but it's basically like, we start in this position where my hand is, and all of a sudden we sort of move all the way over here. And it's like, if we started with, hey, like, I have a job interview tomorrow, I'm nervous about it, we can end, on a thought spiral 20 minutes later with saying like, if I don't get this job, it's going to be the end of my career, and everybody's going to hate me, and everybody's going to unfriend me on LinkedIn, and nobody's going to ever want to talk to me again. And the reason why this step is important, to bring it all back to say, step 2, determine the true importance of what's making you anxious, is to go back and say, my anxiety is making me look at this thing differently than I would otherwise look at it. And again, it's not to say that whatever it is that we're fearful of is not important and isn't a big deal. It's to say that it's possible that we are making it an even bigger deal than it actually is. And to be able to step back and say, let me just take a breather and say, you know what, this job interview, this, this virus, whatever it is that we're dealing with, this is important to me. This is scary, something like that. But it might not necessarily be the end of the world, right? I think making that distinction can bring us some calm. So that was one of the steps that I want to talk about. A couple other ones that we could pepper in there are one that I'll just briefly touch upon, right, is like developing a mantra and just reciting it to yourself whenever you're feeling anxious. Like one that I like to say to myself is, if you get in your head, you're dead. A lot of death references. I'll try to keep it limit those. But that one is sort of like a way for me to just break out of my mind, to be like, look, dude, you're in your head. Get out of there. Get out of there. Get out of there. Right. I will say I borrowed that one from Tony Robbins, personal development guru, who I'm sure some people on the chat are familiar with. But I feel like it fits my brand, and I also feel like it's just a really powerful one to be able to say, like, a really sort of blunt reminder, like, get out of there, So again, folks can definitely check out the full 10-step list in the first book, but wanted to sort of provide that context so that way that we can then jump into the strategies in the second book and have something to compare it against. So when I say, I think I sort of said earlier in the conversation that the first book is more boots on the ground tactics, like, I am fearful, this is what I do. The second book and the tactics in that they're a little more high level. They're a little bit more like perspective shifts and sort of philosophical approaches to the disease itself. I think one of the reasons for that is the fact, like, how they like how they manifest in our bodies, right? Where it's like anxiety, a lot of people say that anxiety is an offshoot of our fight or flight nervous systems. And I mean, there's a lot of science there, and it's, I'm not trying to say that I don't agree with that. I'm just saying, like, that's a very, very strong theory. And it's one that I subscribe to, but it's like, if we look at it from that approach, we basically say, like, hey, okay, our fight or flight nervous systems rev up in the face of a threat. So if I'm standing in front of a bear and I associate, my heart racing, my palms sweating, the inability to think clearly, all of those things with anxiety, we can sort of, working off of the same theory, we can kind of say, like, anxiety and the fight or flight nervous system are really closely linked, really closely coupled. The thing with the fight or flight nervous system, right, is like, as soon as that threat has been eliminated or passed, so if that bear, continues its way on down the woods or whatever, eventually, it might take 5 minutes, it might take 10 minutes, whatever. But our fight or flight nervous system is going to, ramp down. And so it's like, I think one of the reasons why a boots on the ground or like a tactical approach of in the moment sort of strategies with book one and with anxiety, I think that works because of the fact that the fight or flight nervous system is sort of like rev up quickly, rev down quickly for the most part. Don't get me wrong, like, a lot of people deal with chronic anxiety, those sorts of things. Like, I certainly empathize with that, with those conditions. I guess that's kind of just, all I want to say is that's kind of not what I'm touching upon here, right? But I think with depression, it's harder to get out of it as quickly because there's, as far as we know, I don't think there's like a mechanism that is like, hey, something just happened, turn on depression really quickly. And then, oh, okay, like the bear, walked on in the woods, like turn off depression. So just kind of providing that background, but, jumping into some of the tactics that I talk about in the book, again, I think they are higher level. I think they are more philosophical, some of those things, right? So we talk about, like, sometimes I'll refer to different psychologists and researchers over the years. So Aaron Beck has what he calls, I believe it's called the negative triad, or Beck's cognitive triad, excuse me. I'm getting a little late here, kind of jumbling my thoughts. But so basically, like, he has this framework that basically says, like, there's sort of three kinds of beliefs. And if all of those beliefs are negative, then it's very likely that we're going to experience depression. So those are beliefs about ourselves, our world, in the future. So if we say like, if I were to say to myself, right, if I hold these beliefs and saying like, I'm no good, nobody loves me, nothing's good is going to happen to me, and I say the world is a terrible and evil place, and I kind of already touched on this one, but in terms of the future, like nothing good will happen to me, nothing good will happen to my family, whatever. It's very hard to hold those beliefs and not feel some sort of depression, or at the very least, to feel helpless, to feel hopeless. And, I make the argument in the book that like depression, if we boil it down, is a disease of those two feelings. And so if you think about, I'm saying anxiety is, we can sometimes get out of it quicker, or it's something that ramps up quickly and then ramps down quickly. It's hard for us to like sit down, write a few things out and be like, I changed all my beliefs from negative to positive, right? That kind of just doesn't happen overnight. So it is definitely a little bit harder. But again, second book is a little bit more of the philosophical stuff. And I think some of the reason for that is something that we touched upon at the beginning of the conversation, where I introduced, and it's certainly not my framework, but I introduced the notion of this biopsychosocial model, which is basically the idea that different diseases can stem from a confluence of different factors in the biological parts of our lives, the psychological parts of our lives, and the social parts of our lives. And if we break that down and we say like, okay, biological could be like the way that we use our bodies, the food that we eat, our neurotransmitters, our brains, our genetics, whatever. It's like, yeah, we can like we can go from, okay, I had a burger yesterday and today I'll eat a salad, but like that's sort of as quickly as we can change that bucket. In general, I would say changing things on the biological level takes a little while. Obviously, we can go for a run, and that can definitely help us feel better. And there's a lot of science there that shows that exercise is great for depression. But in general, like biological, it is hard to make some of those changes. On the psychological level, right? It's like the thoughts that we think, the beliefs that we hold. We can all think better thoughts pretty much immediately, but again, with the subconscious part is like so much of what we think is ingrained in us, right? And people say, there's sort of the notion of like neurons that fire together, wire together, in the sense of like, I guess another metaphor or saying is like almost as if our brains are like sledding hills with like snow on them, and each thought is like a sled going down and sort of carving a path into the snow. And the more that we go down that path, the more that I guess the track gets worn into the snow, right? So it's like we think that thought, we think that thought, we think that thought, and that gets ingrained inside of us. And so changing those thoughts, especially ones that are, I guess just the ones that we have, habits that we've held on to for a long time, that can be a difficult process too, or a long-term process. But it's sort of, I don't know, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's sort of like we can change those things, but it can take some time. And then on the social side, right, it's like if we don't like our jobs, if we don't like our significant other, if we don't like our friends, we can't just snap our fingers and be like, boom, like I'm out of those negative situations or whatever it is. So on the one hand, it's like, yes, depression is a more long-term fight, I think. But also, like once we know, or once we identify the different sources and then apply those, apply the thinking to our own lives and say like, okay, I need to work on these negative beliefs. I need to work on these negative thoughts. I need to eat better. I need to exercise more. I need to work on my relationship with my family or something like that. We then sort of create a map for moving through our experience. And again, nothing is foolproof here, but I think that's kind of an important, I think in general, the approach works, or it's one that can help us. So I'm, again, kind of rambling, but I think the overall tone is like, I don't necessarily have too many like quickly implementable strategies on the depression front, but I think it's sort of a product of the disease itself, right? It's like because the disease can be longer term, turning it around can also take time. If I were to give one or two strategies that are, we can implement quickly, I think so. The first one we talked about was like, exercising, like going for a run, getting back into our bodies, getting out of our heads. Sure, maybe it doesn't like cure our depression for months or something like that, but it can definitely give us a boost. We get some endorphins or something like that. There's another strategy that's interesting. There's some research about it, but not like overwhelming amounts. It's basically like taking a cold shower or like jumping in, plunging into a cold bath. And obviously like that's a tough one, right? I've definitely implemented that strategy before, but it's hard and not everybody's going to want to do it. And there's a lot of times where I don't want to do it. I'll kind of spare the science here just because I've iterated on this answer for a while. But basically, it's sort of like we've got cold receptors on our skin, and when we come in contact with cold water, it kind of sends an antidepressive effect up towards our brains. Again, the science is kind of nascent or early on here, but I think I've used it sometimes. It can be helpful. So very long-winded, a little rambly, but I think that's my answer there.
Yeah, cold showers. That's a no for me. I've tried them.
It's a no for me, dog.
You feel better. Yeah, right. You do feel better after it's done, but I feel so miserable while my showers are steaming hot, like as hot as I can possibly get the water to stand, because that's what makes me feel better during and after most of the time. But cold showers are very good for your hair also.
That's interesting.
And there's a lot of people really swear by even like ice baths, like that cold of water. There's a lot of things that are showing that is really good for you on many different levels. Not only, mentally, but also physically, that has some real benefits. So I agree. But yeah, I mean, on the whole, I think anxiety and depression are two very different things. And a lot of people, that comorbidity of anxiety and depression happens so often that a lot of people conflate the two. And it's good to hear you say, like, my toolkit for depression is different. It's on a higher level. And I think that, to me, what I'm hearing is your rituals are really based on supporting your depression or supporting the prevention of depression. And then the toolkit is more for the anxiety, or the toolkit that you have for anxiety is more like, I'm going to pull these out as I need them. So, like, I think that what is it? Ounce of prevention is better than pound of cure. So I think that those rituals, and I say rituals, I mean routines, whatever your term is for it. But I think that that's something that's really important to get those in place and to do them consistently for depression. I agree. And then of course work with all of your providers to do what works for you and find what works for you, because different things work for different people, and different kinds of depression responds to different things. So yeah, that's it's really good to hear you say all of that. I think that that's very, very true. They're completely different from one another, and you treat them differently as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's I like how you put it, right? Kind of the depression tactics are kind of like almost forming the foundation and like life habits and whatnot, and then you can sometimes pull the anxiety strategies out when you need them. At the same time, I will say in the first book, I do provide some more of the holistic kind of habits. It's like if you create a daily meditation practice for yourself or something like that, that can be more on the holistic level, but definitely overall like the approach that you the way that you eloquently put it.
Yeah. And meditation and things like that, if we go kind of that route of things, those are very that train of thought just went completely out of my head. It stopped. Like it hard stopped on the tracks there. I don't know what happened. But like meditation, it can really get you into draw you out of that space of where you're talking about kind of that hopelessness and everything. It can draw you into kind of like taking your thoughts and rearranging them a little bit, or just kind of getting out of your thoughts a little bit. Like you said, get out of your head a little bit. So I had somewhere else I was going with that, but it's long gone. I don't know what happened.
No worries. I'm feeling it, with it being a little bit later on the East Coast and being a little tired. I'm feeling myself having one of those moments pretty soon. So
look, I have those moments all day, every day. It's that I call it mom brain. It started when I had my first kid, and sometimes the brain just stops. It just stops working.
I give you a lot of credit. We watched my niece and nephew over vacation, and is like, man, if I was doing that every day, I would be very, very tired. 2 and 6.
2 and 6. Ooh, I would be very tired if I was doing that. My youngest is 9.
Okay.
So he's much more self-sufficient. He still gets up 5 a.m. every day. 5 a.m. gets up.
Wow.
But he can get his own cereal. He can turn on his switch. He can operate the TV remote. He can read a book. Like, he's got all these things. He likes to come and snuggle when he first gets up, so he'll crawl into bed with me and snuggle and everything. So I know when he gets up. But then if he starts getting too wiggly, I'm like, get out.
Yeah.
And he can leave. 2 years old, they can't do that. Even 6 is a little questionable on like pouring milk and stuff. So
yep.
I'm sure you did great.
We did all right.
You also, in addition to being an author, you also offer coaching. So what does a typical coaching session look like, and what are your clients typically looking to get out of coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general practice is sort of like, hopefully the person who I'm working with has read some of my blog posts, has read one of my books or something like that. It's not a requirement, but the overall approach is like, we're going to take the strategies that I talk about and apply them to that person's life, right? I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one is, I don't want it to be just a general like sort of and I say this like tongue in cheek or whatever, right? Because it's like the person isn't coming to my apartment when we're having this session, but I don't want it to be the standard like person sits on the couch and I listen or whatever. It's not sort of just a straight venting session or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that I'm not qualified, like I'm not a licensed therapist or anything like that. So I'm not trying to provide anything of that nature. It's kind of more like the reason why I say coaching, right, is like person tells me some of the things that they're dealing with. I can sort of provide an outside perspective, and then we are taking the strategies that I talk about in my content and apply them to those situations. So I feel as though I am. Again, I say this loosely. I am licensed in my own content, right? Because I don't talk about things. I don't talk about medication in my content. I don't talk about like some of the more clinical stuff. But so it's like, obviously the goal of coaching is to help somebody feel a little bit better. But I need to be careful in the sense that, like, again, not a doctor, not a psychologist, not a therapist or anything like that. So it is sort of like if I were to give that branding, right, of saying like, what is the program? It is again, taking those strategies, applying them to the person's life and trying to help them, move forward in some capacity with those things. Obviously the approach is going to be nuanced where it's like, we're not just coming in being like, hey, did you read the book? And like, tell me steps 1 through 10, whatever. Obviously it is personalized like for each person. So it's like if somebody comes in and they tell me a different story, it's going to be, we're going to veer off on some totally different path than we would have with some other story or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's, I like to say that, a book is a mass market product, right? I cannot write a book just for Jim or Jack or Janie or something like that. With the coaching, we try to develop that a little bit more, right? Where it's like, this can be custom tailored to you. You come in, we have a conversation, and if you're like, hey, these 5 strategies don't work, I don't like them, whatever, we don't talk about those strategies. So it is a different form, it's a different outlet. It is, I think people would probably, if somebody sat in with me, they were like, okay, you're like dangerously close to trying to be a therapist here, but you're not a therapist. So I do like to try to distance myself from that. And again, that's where I just bring in, more of my content, more of my strategies, in hopes that I can help people through what they're dealing with.
Yeah. It sounds like you're more of the like checking in, making sure, have you done this a little bit? Kind of that tough love piece that therapists can't give you. Like therapists are very much, encouraging you to do some things or providing you with tools, but they don't, like, if I go in and I say, look, you told me these 10 strategies, I used 0 of them, sorry about ya. They're not going to say, oh my God, I can't believe you didn't do that, where you as an advocate versus a therapist can say that shit. Like, there are things that therapists cannot say that we can say.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. I like that you said that. And I think one of the other things that's interesting, right, is like having that approach, it's a little scary to do that sometimes because you're like, well, if I like make this person upset, they might just like quit or, might leave or whatever. And it's like, as a coach, if I'm, sticking to my guns and if I really want to help this person, I need to make sure that they follow through with some of the things that I ask them to do, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, I have to be willing to let them walk away. If it means that I think that, them wasting their time or something like that, like if I think that them not doing what I ask of them is them wasting their time, I have to be okay with that. I have to say like, look, here's the plan. Like if you're not willing to try these different things out, that's all right. We can just part ways. But at the end of the day, I'm doing these things because I want to help you. And I hope that you do them for that reason of helping yourself. But if that doesn't work, then that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever had somebody try to challenge what you do as a mental health advocate and coach or trivialize it in any way?
I think one thing, right, is like, I've had some reviews in the past on my books where people are just like, they're like, this person's not a doctor, don't listen to them, this is not good advice, whatever. And, I think my reaction, I would say probably like if I had got one of those reviews within the first month of publishing my first book, I definitely would have been upset. I think as you get older and you go through this a little bit more, like my approach is, I am sorry that that person didn't understand what I was trying to do. I am not offended by it. It's unfortunate that they, felt that they wanted to leave that review on my books. But at the same time, I'm not trying to hide who I am, right? I'm not trying to say, oh, like I'm pretending to be a doctor even though I'm not. Right. It's like within a couple pages of my first book, it's like, I'm not a doctor. I'm not pretending to be, not trying to say that I am. I'm a dude. I've been through some of the same stuff that you have. The reason that I wrote this book is because of that, right? Because I feel as though we can develop a connection. And then when I build trust with you, I can give you some of the strategies that I've used. And hopefully, with that trust, you'll be like, I'm going to go try these things out. So I look at some of those reviews and I say, like, it's disappointing, right? I would hope that people don't see them and say, oh, I'm definitely not reading this book because of what this person wrote. But at the same time, and when I say this person, I mean the reviewer. Yeah. At the same time, like, that's that person's opinion. Again, it's like, it's disappointing because it's like, I'm not pulling any punches or anything like that. But I think it's also one of those things where it's like I try my best and to do better with it on some days than others. I try to think about that person, and I'm like, if that person, is suffering from something and they were looking for a specific kind of solution and they found me and it wasn't that solution, then they, maybe they, I don't know what the right term is, but like maybe they had a right to be upset, or maybe you could expect that they would be upset because what they were looking for did not match what they found. And so it's like, I guess, again, some days I do better with this than others, but it's like, I wish that person well. And I'm like, whatever you are looking for, I hope that you find it. I'm not here to, it's not about me. So,
yeah. I mean, you wrote a fucking book. That is a huge accomplishment. It sucks that not everyone is going to be happy with it. But I know that at the beginning we were talking about good reviews and things that good people say. Like, as long as you can focus on that, I think that that's good. But yeah, I've had people in the past where they're like, oh, you're not a therapist, whatever. I don't pretend to be a therapist. Above my head, right up here on the screen, it says not a pro. That's because I'm not a pro. Like, I'm just a human with lived experience here to help other people and talk through shit. That's it. So it's one of those things that, as long as you can stick with why you're doing it, what you're doing, and kind of just follow through with that, I think that that's a really positive thing, even in the face of people trying to challenge it or trivialize it. So I think you're doing definitely
great. Thank you. And it's an interesting lesson too in mental health in general, where it's like being able to place our attention or our focus on the positive things, as simple as it sounds. It's a really critical skill, right? It's like, any given day, any given moment, there are all sorts of negative things that we can think about, that we can focus on. And sometimes, people may say like, oh, be a realist, be a rationalist, whatever it is. Like, if this thing is bad, like admit it to yourself. And it's like, I could admit it to myself, but I could also just look over there. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't need to stew on it for any reason. So again, yeah, like you said, it's though people may write negative reviews. People may not like all the content. People may object. But there are still good things over there, and for my own sanity and for the sake of, the people that I, readers, listeners, my audience, that sort of thing, I focus on those good things as I think most people should, even though it is difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And what's really fun to me is that I've been in the position, I've been on other podcasts and stuff where I've asked other therapists and counselors and people that are licensed. They went to school for this shit. They did all the right things. I couldn't do what they do, quite honestly. But I've asked them, like, is there a place for mental health advocates? Do you think that it's a good thing that people are out here talking about their own experiences and everything? 100% of them, every single person that I've asked who's a licensed therapist, has said yes. That there's a place, that there are things that we can do that they are not allowed to do because they are licensed.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I was curious. So very early, whenever I started with my mental health advocacy, I went to, I think it was PAX South, which is a gaming convention. Yep. And they had some panels on mental health, and I went and asked one of the panels, I said, do you think that because they were talking about the gaming community mental health, I said, I went and asked the panel, do you think that there's a place for mental health advocates, or do you think that they should steer clear? And again, overwhelmingly, they were like, no, yes, we need people speaking up about their own experiences and sharing and being open about things. Otherwise, what are we going to be here for? Because no one's going to want to come see us. They won't know the good work that we do because we can't talk about it.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
Do you have a mental health? I'm going to start that one over. Do you have a mental health care provider?
I don't at the moment. I have worked with different practitioners in the past. My short answer is like, I'm always open to different things. And it's like, if I get to the point where I'm like, yeah, I want to start working with somebody again. I need to start working with somebody again. Like, I will absolutely do that. I think, in general, right. It's like, for my own case, I have put together some pretty solid stretches for myself where I'm like, I'm doing well. I've come up with these different strategies. I apply them in my own life. Again, that's not to say that I don't struggle from time to time. I think it's sort of when one of those struggles becomes overwhelming or a little bit too much, or I feel as though, even if it's not too much, but it's like, I just want to switch up my strategy here. I feel as though having, regular sessions could be a really good piece for me. Then I'll do that. So, short answer is I don't at the moment, but definitely open to it.
I wish more people would treat therapy that way. Like, use it when you need it. Therapy is not a lifetime commitment. If you need therapy right now, go to therapy. If you don't need it in a month, you work through everything that you need to with your therapist, you can stop going for a little while. Treat it like the dentist. Go every 6 months for a little checkup. And then if you need it in between, go to them again. No big deal.
Yeah. I like that. I think one thing, I don't know if it's changed since. I know that during COVID, it was very hard to find a therapist. So it's possible that, you either can't find one or like, basically pausing and then restarting, like you're kind of starting that search again, going through that difficulty again. I don't know. I guess I would just say to folks that, feel as though they want that resource, they want, therapy in their life, like, I guess, take it seriously. Find some, one of the other difficulties too, right, is like you might be given a therapist and not necessarily feel as though you have a rapport with that person. So it can take some time to go through different therapists. And so I guess, again, just take it seriously, give it some time. And hopefully you find the person that like works for you and, you develop that rapport and eventually make some progress. I guess one last kind of thing, and just a quick disclaimer is like, I'm a mental health advocate. I write books and I put these strategies forth and whatnot. I'm absolutely not a person who had I believe in all of the different strategies. I'm definitely, just because I come from a non-traditional route doesn't mean that, I am against medication. I am against therapy, anything like that. I actually firmly believe for every single person that is listening and for every person out there, it's like, try out all of these different things. See how they make you feel. Put together the best game plan for you, because it's going to be different for every person.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on what state you're in, there are different medications you can try with or without a prescription. So I'm in Texas. I don't get to do any of that fun stuff, unfortunately.
Oh, interesting. I would kind of, I don't know the laws very well. I would kind of think that Texas would be on the more...
We are very Bible Belt here.
Okay.
Very,
yeah. Good point. I'm thinking more like Austin, Texas. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now you go to Austin, I'm sure you can find. I think actually Austin just decriminalized. Well, not decriminalized. They stopped writing tickets for marijuana possession. I'll have to look up what it was. I think Austin City does not write tickets anymore. I know Dallas doesn't write tickets anymore for marijuana possession, which is great because. It means that, nobody's going to jail for it in those cities. Even if you don't have a felony amount, I think is what it is. Which I don't know how they determine felony amount, if it's like gummies or something. But
yeah,
if you are in Texas, though, you can get D8, which is very similar.
Yeah. I will say, I don't know if anybody can hear it. Sometimes, the microphone is more sensitive if you're listening to it, but my neighbor's infant is crying. So hopefully,
I can't hear it.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I keep muting and being like, hopefully nobody can hear him.
I don't hear anything. Even if you could hear it, you could just blame it on me and say one of my kids was crying in the other room. Totally neglecting them. Although if they were crying, they would come in here. For those of you who are looking for a mental health provider, or if you're having trouble finding one, or if you need low cost options or anything like that, I posted a link to some mental health resources that you can go to. There's ones for online, there are therapist finders, there's all kinds of things that you can go and you can look at those and find one that works for you. So I know we were talking about trouble finding a therapist. It's definitely important to find one that works for you. And if your therapist isn't clicking with you, isn't working with you, you can always find another one. So that's something that we say a lot here is you can always fire your therapist if it's not working out well. I had a bad experience with a therapist and I didn't know that I could fire her back then. So knowing what I know now, it's much easier to find a new therapist and find one that you mesh with, so
definitely.
If you need any of those resources, the link is in the chat and I'll post it with this episode as well.
Yeah. And it's like, it can be expensive, right? It's like, if you are paying for it, get your money's worth, find that person.
Yes, absolutely. If you weren't doing what you do now, what would you be doing instead?
Yeah, I thought about this one a little bit. I would do something like totally random or different. I guess sort of like taking all constraints aside, right? Saying money is not an issue and yada, yada, yada. Just like do something like just the thing itself. I've always been really interested. Like I love theme parks. I love going, on roller coasters and rides and stuff like that. I would probably find some kind of job related to that. Like, I think a lot of people want to be Disney Imagineers. I think that would be really interesting. I don't think I'm smart enough or creative enough for that, but that would be cool. Even just, in some capacity, some sort of job at a theme park, that would actually be fun, right? It's like, I don't think I'd really want to be a ride operator or a vendor, no offense, but it's like, it's kind of mundane. Like it would be fun to create the experiences. I would definitely enjoy that. And the only reason I hesitate is then you kind of think, I had a conversation with this person. They're like, yeah, the industry doesn't pay that well. And COVID really hurt whatever. But it's just like, take all the other things, in a vacuum or take everything out of the equation. It's like, that would be a fun job for me, is to create things like that.
I don't think I've ever considered being a designer or anything like that for a theme park ever. That's just never crossed my mind that it's even a job for someone, but it totally is.
It is. Yep.
So Bite Mark couldn't be here, but she asked, what is your favorite poem?
Yeah, so I will be totally honest and say that I don't read a lot of poetry. So my answer is going to be kind of not canned, but like if I read a lot of poetry, I'd give you some poem that like not a lot of people have heard of before or whatever. Because I don't read a lot of poetry, it's just gonna be kind of a generic answer. But I do like the Robert Frost poem, which is the Road Not Taken, I think it's called.
Yes.
There's a lot of different interpretations of it. I think all of them are good. I like the fact. So I think the traditional one, the one that most people think about, is like, there's two paths. One is sort of what's the right word? It's like people have traveled it. There are no obstacles in the way. The grass is trodden down. It's very, clear and distinct. It's like, okay, it's all sand or all dirt or whatever. Just follow that. Like all you got to do is follow it. And then, the other one is like, okay, I'm looking at this thing in the woods, but like it's kind of unclear where it goes. It's obvious that not a lot of people have walked this path before. So it's sort of this like either nonconformist attitude or like courageous attitude of like, I am going to do difficult things that other people have not done. I think that's really cool. I like that approach. I think in general, right? It's like you think about the people that you idolize, the people that you look up to. You look at creators over time. People have created great brands and art and content and stuff like that. It's like sort of to be, one of those famous people. And obviously, it's hard to exactly put a formula on it or something like that. But it's like you want to be known and recognized for things, like you got to be a little bit different, a little bit edgy, whatever, right? So I like that interpretation. I think the other interpretation, which is like, if you read it, he's like, I looked at both paths and I couldn't really tell where like either of them went because they start curving and stuff. So like I eventually just made a decision, and that was important. And I think that being able to say like, just in general, decision making is like, it's a really important thing. It's a pivotal thing, right? It's like, so you look back, I think to myself, it's like, I look back and I'm like, if I went to a different college, if I met a different set of friends, where your entire life can be different. And so I like that interpretation as well, sort of like the butterfly effect kind of thing.
That's what I was just thinking about.
Yeah. So I like both of those interpretations. I don't know. I think one of the beauties of like art and whatever, right, is like you can have your own interpretation, and whatever it means to you, it means to you. I think about this all the time where like there were so many songs that me and all my friends used to sing in like high school and whatever. And it's like, we didn't look up the lyrics. Most of the time we had them wrong. Even if we had them right, like we weren't thinking, if you then if now you go online and you're like, oh, what does this song mean? And like you get this interpretation, you're like, that's not what it meant to me. Or you find the lyrics and they're like talking about bad things and you're like, we didn't know that and we didn't care,
Right.
It's like what you make sense of things however you want to make sense of them, and that's not always a bad thing.
You might be old enough to remember this commercial, but you also might not be, because I don't remember when it was. All I remember is I think, a teenager. So do you remember the commercial? I think it's a Volkswagen commercial where they're singing the song, Pour Some Sugar on Me. And the guy says, pour some soup upon me. And then
I definitely remember that one.
Commercial for Shazam or something. One of those things. Or it might have been a Volkswagen commercial in conjunction with Shazam. I don't know. But they had an argument over what the lyric was. Do you remember that commercial at all?
Yeah, doesn't he say like pour some shook up ramen or something like that?
I don't know.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, it's something like
weird.
that. But it's so funny how now we can just look it up. That wasn't a thing. That wasn't a thing back then. Well, it is time for the magic moment of the stream, and I happen to have a magic wand here. So if you could wave this magic wand, let me stop blinking so much. There we go. If you could wave this magic wand and eliminate one common opinion, misconception, or theory surrounding mental illness, disabilities, or talking about mental health, what would it be? And I'm just going to give it a little wave for you.
Yeah, I think it would just be the incorrect notion that mental illness is a weakness, that dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression, something like that is, a character flaw or a weakness.
Yeah, that's a big one. That would be really helpful.
That would be great.
Yep. Well, I'm going to open it up to the community and just see if anybody has any questions. But if you have anything that we didn't talk about, resources you want to throw out there, sites, personal recommendations, feel free. I'll just give the floor over to you for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a lot. I don't have a ton to add. It's not that there aren't resources to give. It's just like we gave a lot to chew on. Yes. So I think it's a good sort of stopping point, or at least turning it over to see if anybody has any questions.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'm just going to say thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time and just coming here and talking with us. I think this is a really good conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Likewise, definitely a good conversation. It's always nice to get people's perspectives, especially someone like yourself who has had a lot of these conversations, who has experiences themselves. Don't get me wrong, like I enjoy every conversation I have, but there are some where it's like, somebody just asking questions and me giving answers. It's nice to have that back and forth and to be like, oh, well, here's my perspective, here's an idea, whatever, and be able to ping pong a little bit.
I always worry that I'm doing like an accidental one-up kind of thing whenever I do that. So I'm glad to hear that it's more conversational than sometimes I think that I'm being.
Yeah, it definitely didn't come off that way at all. If anything, there was times where I was kind of, rambling or whatever. And I'm like, I'm glad that she kind of polished it off.
Well, okay. Well, I don't see anything else from chat, so I'm just going to say thank you. And chat, give me just a minute. I'll be back. I'm going to disconnect with Brian offline, and then I'll be back playing some Minion Master. So give me just 1 minute.
Awesome.
I hope you found this conversation as thought-provoking and empowering as I did. Mental health advocacy is a crucial aspect of our lives, whether you are a mental health advocate on purpose or you are just talking to a friend. And it's really heartening to see people like Brian making a difference in this space. Mental health is not a one-size-fits-all journey, and it is absolutely okay to seek help and support when needed. In fact, we encourage it here. Whether it's finding the right therapist, trying out different strategies, or simply having open conversations about mental health, every step matters, and everything you do can make a bit of difference in your own life. If you'd like to learn more about Brian's work or connect with him, don't forget to check out our website, tacosfallapart.org, for today's links, plus additional resources and even previous episodes. As we conclude today's episode, I want to express my gratitude for all of our listeners for joining us on this mental health exploration today. Your support really does mean the world to me, and I am committed to bringing you more engaging and valuable content on an ongoing basis, hopefully. If you enjoyed today's episode and found it helpful, please consider leaving the show a review and sharing the podcast with your friends and family. Every share, every like, every review that we can get really does make a difference and helps us reach more people. Together, we can create a more compassionate and understanding world when it comes to mental health. Remember, it is okay to not be okay, and it's even more okay to talk about it. Let's continue to break the stigma and support each other on this journey to mental well-being. Thank you once again for tuning in to Even Tacos Fall Apart. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Keep advocating, keep learning, and remember, you are not alone.